I'll never forget the day she smiled at me and said, "It was just a harmless prank." But as I stared at the jury, I knew they were about to hand down a verdict that would change everything: attempted murder, and it was all because of her twisted idea of fun. The afternoon seemed like any other in our quiet, suburban neighborhood. The kind of day where the sun shines brightly in a clear blue sky, kids are playing outside, and everything feels safe. Dylan, my 12-year-old son, was spending the day at his friend's house, a routine I had grown accustomed to. He was a cheerful, healthy boy, always full of energy and with a smile that could light up any room. He had diabetes, yes, but it was something we had learned to manage over the years. We knew how to handle it, watching his sugar levels, keeping track of his insulin, and always being cautious. But despite all of that, it never fully stopped the fear that comes with the constant reality of his condition. That afternoon, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. Dylan was supposed to be having fun, taking a break from his usual school routine. When I arrived at his friend's house to pick him up, I noticed something was off right away. Dylan wasn't his usual energetic self. His face was pale, his body trembling. He tried to smile, but it was clear something was terribly wrong. His hands, usually so steady, were shaking violently as he clutched his insulin pump with a desperate grip, as if it was the only thing that could hold him together. At first, I thought maybe it was just a little slip-up. Perhaps his blood sugar was a bit off, or maybe he hadn't had enough to eat. We had seen these close calls before, and they were always scary but manageable. But as I watched him, I knew this time was different. He couldn't stand up straight. His breathing was shallow, labored. I rushed him to the car, trying to remain calm while my heart was racing in my chest. I knew exactly what was happening. His blood sugar levels were crashing, but there was something else in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. The hospital was just a few minutes away, but those minutes felt like hours. I was on the phone with the doctor, trying to explain what I thought might be happening. When we finally arrived, the doctors took over, and they immediately started working on stabilizing him. They hooked him up to machines, ran tests, and gave him fluids to try and bring him back to consciousness. But all I could think about was how Dylan had been fine just a few hours ago. What went wrong? That's when I learned the devastating truth. The hospital staff were in disbelief, trying to piece together what had happened. It turned out that the cause of Dylan's collapse wasn't a simple mistake or a minor error in his routine. It was far worse. Rachel, the neighbor girl who had always been around, was the one behind it. She had decided, for reasons that still didn't make sense to me, that it would be fun to mess with Dylan's insulin. When I first heard it, I couldn't believe it. Rachel, the girl who had been friendly with my son for years, the one I'd known since she was a child, had done this to him. Her idea of a prank was so twisted that it defied any logic I had. What she didn't realize, what she clearly didn't understand, was that tampering with a diabetic's insulin isn't just a prank. It's deadly. Insulin is the lifeline for someone with diabetes. Without it, their blood sugar can drop dangerously low, leading to a coma or worse. Rachel didn't just mess with Dylan's insulin in a careless way. She went much further than that. She didn't adjust his dosage slightly or even forget to give him his insulin. She dumped his entire vial of insulin, the vial that was meant to regulate his blood sugar levels, the vial that could have kept him from slipping into a diabetic coma. What was meant to be a joke became an act of negligence, cruelty, and, in the end, an attempted murder. At that moment, when I realized the depth of what she had done, a cold, suffocating rage took hold of me. How could anyone think it was okay to do something like this? To put a life at risk for the sake of amusement? Dylan wasn't just my son, he was a child who trusted the people around him. He trusted Rachel, and she had broken that trust, just like that, with no care for the consequences. As the doctors worked to stabilize Dylan, the overwhelming wave of panic started to fade, replaced by a single question. How could this happen? How could a child, someone so young, be so cruel? It was hard to process the reality of what had occurred. I wanted answers, and I wasn't going to rest until I got them. My son was in danger because of someone who had no concept of the devastation their actions could cause. The gravity of the situation was just beginning to set in, and I realized this wouldn't be over any time soon. The road ahead was going to be filled with questions, anger, and a fight for justice. But for now, all I could do was sit and watch, praying that Dylan would pull through. The urgency of the situation quickly set in, though I tried not to let panic take over. At first, I thought that if I could just stay calm, if I could keep my head straight, everything would be fine. But as I drove Dylan to the hospital, every minute felt like an eternity. The fact that he was slipping into a state of unconsciousness only intensified my fear. I could feel the pounding in my chest, the tightness in my throat. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, all of them screaming the same question. How could this happen? How could Rachel, someone we had trusted, someone who had always been a part of Dylan's life, do something so reckless, so utterly dangerous? The more I thought about it, the more the weight of the situation became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a simple mistake or an accidental mishap. This wasn't a harmless joke gone wrong. This was deliberate. Rachel had intentionally tampered with my son's insulin, a move that could have easily ended his life. It wasn't something that could be easily fixed with a quick dose of sugar or some water. What she had done was irreversible, and every second that passed felt like one closer to losing him. By the time we arrived at the hospital, I could barely keep it together. The medical staff took over immediately, and they moved with impressive speed. But I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of helplessness. I stood in the corner of the room, watching them work frantically to stabilize him. Every beep of the machines, every measured movement of the nurses felt like a countdown, each passing second reminding me how much worse this could have been. Dylan was my son, my child. I had to hold on to the hope that they could save him, but it was hard to keep that hope alive when the gravity of the situation hung over us like a dark cloud. The hospital staff asked questions, running tests and taking blood samples, trying to understand the full extent of what had happened. The doctors spoke in hurried tones as they adjusted machines and administered fluids to stabilize Dylan's vitals. Despite all their efforts, they couldn't provide immediate answers. All I could do was wait. I had no control over the situation. My mind kept coming back to Rachel. How could someone, especially a child, do something so horrifying? I had known her for years. She was just another kid in the neighborhood, one I'd always assumed was harmless. But now I saw her for what she truly was: reckless, selfish, and completely unaware of the consequences of her actions. Rachel's parents, too, were part of the picture, and their response was just as bewildering as their daughter's actions. They were contacted, of course, but when they arrived at the hospital, their demeanor was not one of concern, but of confusion. They seemed almost unaware of the severity of the situation. Rachel's mother insisted it was just a prank, and that nothing bad would come from it. How could anyone downplay what had just happened to my son? The severity of their indifference was appalling. It was as if they couldn't fathom the consequences of their daughter's actions, or perhaps they didn't want to. I tried to keep it together, tried to remain focused on the task at hand, getting my son through this. But inside, I was seething with frustration. Every moment spent in that sterile hospital room only seemed to stretch on longer than the last. The doctors assured me that Dylan was in stable condition now, but I couldn't ignore the fact that we had almost lost him. And I couldn't shake the reality that Rachel had nearly taken him from me. Hours felt like days as they monitored his progress. The doctors couldn't give a clear timeline on when Dylan would wake up, but they assured me that his condition was improving. Still, there was a cold knot in my stomach. No amount of medical intervention could erase the fact that my son had been so close to death. The damage was already done. He'd been unconscious for over an hour, and that could have been the end of him. If I hadn't acted as quickly as I did, if I hadn't known exactly what was happening when I saw him, I might have lost him. The thought of that sent a chill through me, a feeling I couldn't shake, no matter how many times the doctors said he was stable. But stability wasn't enough. Stable meant that he had survived the immediate danger, but there was still the question of how this would affect him in the long term. How would he be affected emotionally Physically, the mental scars of something like this wouldn't be easily healed. What Rachel had done was more than just a mistake. It was a violation of trust, a cruel betrayal of a child's safety. As the hours passed, Dylan slowly began to wake up. His eyes fluttered open, groggy and disoriented. He looked around the room, clearly unsure of where he was or what had happened. He tried to speak, but his voice was weak, his body still recovering from the shock of what had occurred. Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the overwhelming knowledge of just how close we had come to losing him. At that moment, I knew the fight wasn't over. I wasn't just fighting to get my son back to health. I was fighting for justice, for the truth to come out, for Rachel's actions to be held accountable. This wasn't just about a prank gone wrong. This was about a life being put at risk, a life that could have been lost in an instant. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Rachel's response to what she had done was, without a doubt, one of the most chilling things I had ever encountered. When I confronted her, expecting at least a semblance of remorse, I was met with something completely unexpected. Indifference. There was no apology, no hint of regret. Instead, she shrugged it off, telling me it was all just a harmless prank. She claimed that she'd meant no harm, that it was all in good fun. To her, the idea of tampering with my son's insulin, the very substance that keeps him alive, was nothing more than a mischievous joke, one that she thought would freak him out for a bit, but wouldn't really cause any lasting damage. As I stood there, listening to her absurd justification, I felt a cold fury rise within me. How could she possibly believe that something so dangerous could be considered a prank? There are no words to describe the sense of disbelief I felt at that moment. To her, it was a harmless laugh, but to me, it was an assault on my child's life. This was not just a joke, it was an act of reckless negligence, one that nearly cost my son his life. And yet, Rachel had the audacity to act as if it was nothing more than a small, inconsequential trick. But it wasn't just me who was furious. The entire neighborhood reacted with shock and anger. Word spread quickly, and soon, people from all over the block came to us, expressing their disbelief and offering their support. It wasn't long before we learned that Rachel had a history of pulling similar pranks. In the past, none of them as severe as what had happened with Dylan, but still unsettling in their own right. Apparently, she had a reputation for playing tricks on people, taking things too far, and showing a complete disregard for the potential consequences of her actions. One of the neighbors mentioned that just last month, Rachel had played a prank on another child in the neighborhood, tampering with their food as a joke. That child had a peanut allergy, and Rachel thought it would be funny to sneak peanuts into their snack. Fortunately, the child hadn't eaten it, but the parents had been livid when they found out. Rachel's behavior seemed to escalate over time, with her sense of boundaries becoming more and more blurred. Her idea of what constituted a joke was dangerously warped. She seemed to believe that the more outrageous and shocking the prank, the better. What she didn't understand, however, was that there are certain lines you just don't cross. Her actions toward Dylan weren't just thoughtless, they were malicious and deeply irresponsible. As the weeks went by, we realized that the consequences of Rachel's actions were beginning to unfold in ways we hadn't anticipated. People started talking. It became clear that Rachel's behavior had not gone unnoticed by others in the community. The anger toward her intensified as more and more people came forward with their own stories of being victims of her thoughtless pranks. It was like a dam had burst, stories of Rachel's previous reckless behavior flooded out, and it became impossible for anyone to ignore just how dangerous her sense of humor had been all along. But while the neighborhood was rallying behind us, offering support, and calling out Rachel for what she had done, there was still the issue of what was going to happen next. The police had been notified, and an investigation had been opened into the incident. Rachel's actions had crossed a line, and there were legal consequences to consider. She had caused physical harm to Dylan, and the emotional toll on him was just as damaging. Her so-called prank wasn't just about a bad joke, it was an attempt on my son's life. The more I thought about it, the more the weight of her recklessness hit me. How could anyone, especially someone who was supposed to be a friend to my son, treat his life so casually. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Rachel's actions were not going to go unpunished. The severity of what she had done could not be ignored, and the more the authorities looked into it, the more it became obvious that this wasn't just a simple prank gone wrong. What Rachel had done was a deliberate act of endangerment, one that had put my son's life at risk. And while she had tried to downplay it, trying to convince everyone that it was all just a misunderstanding, there was no escaping the truth. The legal system began to take its course. Rachel's parents, who had originally dismissed the incident as just a minor mistake, could no longer ignore the severity of the situation. They had to face the reality that their daughter's actions had consequences, real, lasting consequences. The weight of the law was coming down hard, and it was only a matter of time before Rachel had to face the full extent of her recklessness. In the meantime, Dylan had a long road to recovery ahead of him. His physical health was stable, but the emotional scars from what had happened would take much longer to heal. He trusted Rachel, and she had betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. The fear that lingered in his eyes whenever he thought about the incident was heartbreaking. The psychological toll of what Rachel had done was something that could not be fixed overnight. The community stood with us, but Rachel was now alone in the wake of her actions. The prank that she had thought would be a harmless joke had turned into a nightmare that she would have to live with for the rest of her life. The reality of what she had done was finally sinking in, and the consequences were beginning to show. What had started as a twisted sense of humor had spiraled into something far darker, something that no one could laugh off anymore. The trial was the moment everything came to a head. The courtroom, usually a place where legal arguments unfold methodically, was filled with tension as the prosecution laid out its case. Rachel's defense, which initially tried to paint the incident as a momentary lapse in judgment or a harmless prank gone awry, crumbled under the weight of irrefutable evidence. There was nothing trivial about what she had done, nothing that could be swept away by a flimsy excuse. The prosecution, however, was relentless. They painted a vivid picture of the events that had transpired, using every available piece of evidence to demonstrate just how severe Rachel's actions had been. They played the video footage taken from a security camera in the house, which had captured the entire incident. The footage showed Rachel laughing in the background as Dylan struggled to stay conscious, his body slowly deteriorating as the insulin levels in his system fluctuated dangerously. The video left no room for doubt. This was not an accident. It was a deliberate act, one that showed not only a complete lack of empathy, but a disturbing disregard for the safety and well-being of another person. The defense tried to argue that Rachel never intended to hurt anyone, that her actions were simply a misguided attempt at humor. But the prosecution wasn't having it. They brought up the medical reports that detailed just how dire Dylan's condition had been. The doctors had been clear. If not for the quick intervention and emergency care, he could have gone into a coma or even died. The situation had been critical, and Rachel's actions had played a central role in pushing it to that breaking point. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was the testimony of the paramedics who had responded to the emergency. They described the scene when they arrived at the house, Dylan barely conscious, his breathing erratic, his body showing signs of insulin shock. The paramedics explained the immediate danger that Dylan had been in and how close they had come to losing him. Hearing these accounts from professionals who deal with life-or-death situations on a daily basis drove home the severity of Rachel's actions. As the trial went on, Rachel's demeanor became more telling. She sat in the defendant's chair, trying to appear composed, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of nervousness, a creeping realization that her fate was no longer in her hands. Her earlier confidence, the same attitude she had when she'd first brushed off the incident as a harmless prank, began to fade. In the face of overwhelming evidence, the cracks in her defense began to show. Rachel's parents, who had initially been so defensive and dismissive of the situation, were now noticeably absent from the trial. It became clear that they were no longer willing to protect their daughter's reckless behavior. The courtroom buzzed with the realization that their indifference had only added to the gravity of the situation. They had failed to step in when they should have, allowing their daughter's dangerous behavior to escalate to this point. As the trial unfolded, it was evident that their attempts to downplay what had happened were not going to be enough to shield Rachel from the consequences of her actions. The turning point came when Rachel took the stand. Her voice wavered as she tried to explain herself, but the more she spoke, the less believable she seemed. She claimed that she had no idea the insulin would have such severe consequences, that she never thought her prank would cause harm. But the jury wasn't buying it. How could someone not understand the potential danger of tampering with someone's insulin? How could anyone be so ignorant, so detached from the reality of the situation, to think that altering someone's life-saving medication could be anything but catastrophic? Rachel's inability to comprehend the gravity of her actions became her undoing. The more she insisted that it had all been a joke, the more the jury saw her as someone who had not only made a dangerous mistake, but someone who refused to take responsibility for the consequences of that mistake. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the harm she had caused. Her complete lack of remorse only fueled the perception that she had no understanding of the severity of the crime she had committed. As the closing arguments were made, the courtroom was filled with a tense silence. The defense's attempt to argue that Rachel's actions were a simple misunderstanding, a joke gone wrong, felt increasingly out of touch with the reality of the situation. The prosecution's case, with its well-documented evidence and emotional testimony, had made it clear that what Rachel had done was not a mistake. It was an act of reckless endangerment, one that had put a child's life in jeopardy. The jury deliberated for hours. The tension was palpable, and outside the courtroom, friends, family, and the public waited anxiously for the verdict. Rachel's fate rested in their hands, and everyone knew how serious the charges against her were. The weight of her actions had already been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. The only question was whether the jury would acknowledge the severity of her crime and hold her accountable for what she had done. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, and with a steady voice, he read the verdict: guilty of attempted murder. The room went still, and for a moment it felt like time had stopped. Rachel's face went pale as the word sank in. She had been convicted of attempting to take the life of another person, a child no less, and the consequences were now clear. She would face the legal repercussions of her actions, and the jury's decision was a stark reminder that there are lines that should never be crossed. The conviction was a victory for justice, but it was bittersweet. My son would never forget what had happened to him. The emotional scars would remain long after the trial was over, and the physical recovery, while important, wasn't the full picture. Rachel had taken something from him that could never truly be replaced: his sense of security, his trust in those around him. But at least in that moment, there was a sense that justice had been served. Rachel's so-called prank had been exposed for what it truly was: an attempt to destroy a life, not a joke. The shock of the verdict didn't immediately wear off. When the judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, announcing the guilty verdict of attempted murder, everything seemed to freeze for a moment. Rachel's expression, once full of defiance and misplaced confidence, shifted to something unrecognizable. She paled, her body stiffened, and for the first time in the entire trial, she looked as though the gravity of her actions had truly sunk in. There was no longer any shrugging off the seriousness of what had happened, no dismissing it as a harmless prank. The reality had set in. She had tried to take my son's life, and now she would face the consequences. But as Rachel's fate was sealed, my own feelings were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Relief washed over me first. After everything we had gone through, after watching my son struggle with the physical and emotional aftermath of her actions, it felt like the right thing had finally been done. Justice had been served in the most painful and exact way. But then came the anger. The years of my son's life that had been stolen from him, the trauma that he would carry with him for the rest of his life, couldn't simply be undone by a court decision. No sentence could reverse the scars Rachel had left. The emotional toll on my son was just as severe as the physical one. It wasn't just about the insulin. It was about trust. Rachel had been someone Dylan considered a part of his world. He had trusted her, never once suspecting that she could harm him, let alone try to end his life in such a twisted way. That betrayal was the hardest thing to reconcile, and even now, with the trial behind us, it loomed large in his mind. The emotional scars that Rachel had inflicted were invisible, but no less real. They would require years of therapy support and time to even begin to heal. But as for Rachel, the verdict had shattered the illusion of impunity that she had been living under. Throughout the trial, she had insisted that it was just a joke gone wrong, a mistake that had been blown out of proportion. She had believed for a time that her actions would be brushed aside, that she would walk away unscathed. She had assumed that her past history of pranks, however reckless, would be overlooked, that she could simply move on and forget the consequences. But the jury saw through that. They saw the truth of what she had done, and they held her accountable in a way that no one, not even Rachel herself, had expected. This was no longer a story of a prank gone wrong. This was a story of someone so detached from reality, so disconnected from the real consequences of her actions, that she had risked another person's life for the sake of a laugh. The more we learned about Rachel's past, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated incident. Her history was riddled with similar reckless behaviors. She had a pattern of disregarding the safety and well-being of others for the sake of her own amusement. It wasn't until this moment, when she stood convicted and facing the full weight of her actions, that the extent of her recklessness became truly undeniable. But even with the verdict, there's a deep sense of unease. What had happened to us, what had happened to my son, could never be forgotten. The trial had been a battle, yes, but the war for healing and justice had just begun. Rachel's punishment would come, but that wouldn't undo the damage. Dylan would still face the aftermath of that day. Every time he had to manage his insulin, every time he felt the deep, lingering fear that something might go wrong again. For him, the trauma wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He had been permanently altered by what Rachel had done, and the challenge of rebuilding that trust in the world around him was a long and daunting one. As the sentencing date approached, there was a sense of finality that was both comforting and unsettling. It was clear that Rachel had no idea the extent of the destruction she had caused. She had been blinded by her own selfishness and inability to grasp the gravity of her actions. But now, as the verdict was handed down, it wasn't just about her anymore, it was about us. It was about my son's future, about our family's recovery, and about making sure that something like this never happened to anyone else. The ripple effects of this trial reached far beyond our family. The community, which had initially been divided in its opinions, had come together. People who had been hesitant to speak out, who had doubted whether Rachel's actions warranted such severe consequences, now stood firm in their support for us. They saw the truth. They saw the harm Rachel had caused, and they understood that this was not just about one child, but about protecting the vulnerable from a person who had shown no regard for anyone's safety. And yet, even with all of this support, the questions still lingered. How did someone like Rachel get to this point? How did her sense of humor become so twisted, so detached from reality? Could something have been done to intervene earlier? Could someone have stopped her before she went too far? These questions didn't have simple answers. But as I looked at my son, the fear in his eyes slowly giving way to a cautious sense of peace, I knew that, at least for now, we could take some solace in the fact that Rachel would no longer be able to harm anyone else. Justice had been served. But the true victory, the one that mattered most to us, was that my son would finally have a chance to heal and move forward. The verdict might not have healed all of his wounds, but it was a step toward reclaiming control of his life, toward ensuring that no one could ever again treat him or anyone else the way Rachel had. If you want more jaw-dropping stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Expect Stories and hit the bell icon.